Are we experiencing global birth pangs? Occupying Till He Comes at Southwest Prophecy Ministries. Friends, welcome to today's edition of the Last Days Beacon program. This is David Schnitcher, your host for today's program. Thanks for joining us. The purpose of the Last Days Beacon program is to equip you as an end-time saint. On today's program, I would like to share briefly where we are on God's prophetic timetable and how we should live as a result. For assistance in dealing with those questions, we're going to be looking today briefly at the Olivet Discourse, the first chapter of that, Matthew 24, because it gives to us an overview of the periods beginning in the first century and extending all the way to the second coming of Christ. Now, the Olivet Discourse, of course, is contained in chapters 24 and 25 of the book of Matthew. We'll just be looking at Matthew chapter 24 today because it gives an overview of the 6 periods of time leading up to the second coming of Christ. And those periods of time include the temple destruction, Matthew 24, verse 2, the end is not yet period of Matthew 24, verse 6 and 7, and then the beginning of sorrows or birth pangs of Matthew 24, verse 8, then the tribulation period, Matthew 24, verses 9 through 20, then the Great Tribulation period, which is the last half of that 7-year period, is covered in Matthew 24, 21 through 29, and then the events pertaining to the second coming in Matthew 24, 30 and following. So Jesus sets forth 6 periods of time that that culminate with the second coming of Christ at the end of the tribulation. Now, the first 3 periods are of a great length of time. That is the temple destruction, AD 70. The end is not yet, and we'll talk about what that period is. Then we'll talk about the beginning of sorrows or the birth pangs period. Those are of an indeterminate period of time, and actually a great length of time is covered in those first 3 periods. The last 3 periods are of a definite period of time. The tribulation period, the first half, covered in verses 9 through 20, of course, is a 3.5-year period. Then the Great Tribulation is the latter 3.5 years of the tribulation. And then, of course, we know the second coming leads to a 1,000-year millennium. So the last 3 periods of time are definite periods of time, but the first 3 are of an indefinite period of time. So we're just going to give a brief overview of those. Of course, the period 1 was the destruction of the second temple. Jesus talks about that in Matthew 24 and verse 2, where he said to his disciples, "See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." Of course, Jesus is here predicting the destruction of the second temple at the end of the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70. So this is the first period that Jesus talks about as he outlines the sequence of events that will culminate in the second coming. So that is the first period. The second period can be characterized as the end is not yet period, and Jesus talks about that in Matthew 24, 4 through 6. Jesus said, "Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of war. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." So this is the period of time that I call the end is not yet period. Now that period, we know it began in AD 70 with the destruction of the second temple, and has seemingly lasted 1,844 years until 1914, when World War I broke out. And we know that there's that distinction that takes place because in verse 7, Jesus begins to talk about world wars, when kingdoms will fight against kingdoms and nations will rise against nations. There of course, had been wars throughout this not yet period, but the onset of world wars began in 1914 with the First World War. And so that ushers us into the third period, which is the period known as the beginning of sorrows or birth pangs period. And let's read about that in verses 7 and 8 of Matthew 24. For nation shall rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places. So this birth pang period, which precedes the tribulation, this time known as the beginning of sorrows, verse 8, is characterized by world wars and great famines, great pestilences, and great earthquakes. Now, of course, we had our First World War in 1914. Then we had the second iteration of that, the Second World War from 1939 to 1945. Then we've had, of course, a succession of regional conflicts, particularly in the Middle East since 1948. So it has been a period of really ongoing warfare between blocks of nations. So that certainly is descriptive of this period that Jesus predicted as the birth pang period. There are some other characteristics of this period that Jesus talked about, which are pestilences, earthquakes, and famines. So I want to talk about those in the context of the 2020, where we've seen an increase in all of these. Of course, famines have increased during 2020. You'll recall the locust hordes that have eaten vast swaths of agricultural areas throughout Africa in 2020. Combine that with the lockdowns associated with the Wuhan virus. It is estimated that 100 million people will die of starvation in the third world in 2020. So we're seeing an increase of famines, as Jesus predicted. We're also seeing an increase of pestilences. 1918, we saw the Spanish flu, which killed up to 50 million people. Now we are seeing a worldwide virus, what I call the Communist Chinese Party virus, or otherwise known as the Wuhan virus, that has killed over 1 million people in 2020, and who knows how many in the future. And then we are having an increase in great earthquakes. We're seeing this worldwide increase in the number and the intensity of earthquakes around the world. All of these characterize the birth pang period, which leads to the tribulation, which is the next period. But I want to focus on birth pangs just for a few moments. What are birth pangs like? Well, I've never had a child, but I was present when my wife had our 3 children. And so I can say by observation what birth pangs are like. They are intense. They're painful. They are also, though, normally short-lived, and they precede a glorious birth. So here in Matthew 24, the birth pangs that Jesus is talking about portend the birth of a new age. That is the millennium, which occurs, of course, after the second coming of Christ. So he calls this period a period of birth pangs that precedes the second coming of Christ in the glorious millennium. Now, Jesus did not talk about the rapture of the church. That was revealed later through the ministry of Paul. So we know from Paul's writings that the second coming, or the tribulation period, is preceded by another event, a secret event, a mystery, as Paul refers to it. We call it today the rapture, the catching up of the saints. So this tribulation period, which Jesus describes in Matthew 24, is preceded by the rapture. And we could talk a lot about why I believe the rapture precedes the tribulation, but I think to suffice to say that, as Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 9, "For God has not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ." The tribulation is undoubtedly a period when the wrath of God is poured out upon evil, unbelieving humanity. And God is not going to allow or appoint the church to go through this period of wrath. So we know because of that the rapture precedes this time where the wrath of God is poured out upon humanity. Now, going back to the idea of birth pangs, what does a woman do when she is experiencing birth pangs, what are called Braxton Hicks contractions? What do her nurses and doctors tell her to do? They tell her to breathe. That's the best thing that she can do. Just breathe deeply, and as much as possible try to relax. Now, brothers and sisters, as we approach the end of 2020, we need to take a deep breath. God is in control. He has predicted the precise time in which we live. It is a period of birth pangs. Yes, it will be intense and painful. Yes, it will test our faith. But in comparison with eternity, it will be short-lived, and it portends the soon coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. So, brothers and sisters, we need to rejoice at this Christmas time, because our homegoing draws near. It appears that these birth pangs are about to end. Well, friends, thank you for joining us for today's podcast. As we approach the end of 2020, I want to thank you for your prayers and financial support. We could not continue this ministry without your partnership. And Lord willing, I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, this is David Schnitker. Thanks for listening.